The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. The Minnesota legislature regularly deals with issues which ultimately affect the children and families of Minnesota. Our guests today are three leaders in the Minnesota House of Representatives: Dee Long from Minneapolis, Ann Rest from New Hope, and Kathleen Vellenga from St. Paul. We'll talk with Hennepin County Library Director Robert Rohlf about their legislative concerns regarding children and families and some of the issues they see impacting the Minnesota legislature.
Good evening. We're very fortunate this evening to have with us three very distinguished people who have spent a lot of time discussing children-related issues in the state legislature. They've already been introduced to you, so I'll just plunge on with the first question and see what we can find out about the child in our society and how it relates to the legislature. Some of the issues which the legislature faced in the last session were things like health, drug prevention and treatment, housing, protection, child care and welfare, child support, and child custody. I'd like to ask Representative Vellenga, who has spent a lot of time on health and education issues, how she viewed this area of children and how the 1990s legislative session either addressed some of those issues and how successfully it did so. Kind of a loaded question, but could you lead off and then our other representatives can follow?
I think we did make a lot of progress for children in the 1990 session, but I think we're all aware that we're a long way from where we need to be. Children's issues in the legislature, just like in society, are sort of separated into family issues, education issues, healthcare issues, and in the legislature, as in everywhere else, they're dealt with in separate committees, and we haven't always in the past communicated with each other. And this year we've made a real attempt to try to link together what we're doing for children's health care, child protection against child abuse, the child care issues. And we're finding, I think, that the funding, just like everything else, has also been separated out, and we haven't pulled together to see if this, and I think we're making really good progress that way to address it as the entire child within the family setting, within the institution setting, instead of just looking at the different budgets and saying how much here for kids and how much there, and try to put it all together and look ahead in the future for children. I think we're making some good progress that way.
Representative Rest, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
I think Kathleen has summarized very well what the attitude of the legislature is toward looking at, well, as you mentioned, children's place in society, and we are moving toward a non-fragmented view of them, that when we talk about funding for child care, for example, we need to think about that in an educational setting, whether it's within a family or whether it's in a group setting, and that education goes on, for example, everywhere, and it behooves the legislature to think of the child as a learner in almost every setting he or she finds himself. And I think we're starting to do that in Minnesota, and I think it's also a trend on the national level to look at, when we talk about the best interests of the child, we're not only thinking about that in terms of the laws on placing children outside of the home or child neglect, but also in terms of education. What is in the best interest of the child, and providing them with an education, and how early do you start?
Well, one of our guests this evening is the Majority Leader of the House, and I wonder how Representative Long would like to address that issue.
Well, I think I certainly agree with the two previous speakers that we have begun to take a very integrated approach. We've noticed that indeed we hadn't been doing that always in the past. It's become essential that we do so. And the other thing that has struck me in the 12 years I've served in the legislature is the change in the needs just in that time period, and certainly from the last generation. You have most mothers now in the labor force for most of a child's life. That certainly has changed both the needs of the family and the needs for what the legislature should be responding to. And so in a certain sense, we've been playing catch-up. We've been doing a pretty good job of it, but we still have a long, long way to go. And that's frankly the challenge of the 90s, to put all these pieces together and indeed serve the children of this state and the families of this state.
Well, I think your answers kind of lead into a question I was going to ask, and you've almost asked the question for me, but there's a perception that the present child care system or systems have grown in kind of a haphazard way, and that we've been adding money to them over and over again in various programs and with new programs that seem to spring up, but with relatively unknown results of this segmented approach. Have there been any evaluative or comparative measurements put in place lately by the legislature to deal with this? This group needs money for this, or that group needs money for this, and the issues have been identified more singly than collectively. And you've all addressed that, interestingly enough, that they've been piecemealed. So what are you doing now to try to correct that? Or is there anything you can do?
Well, I think one thing that, again, is a national trend that I think Minnesota has been paying attention to, and that is the research that's been done to evaluate programs like Head Start. And that recognizing the success of those programs now among adolescents in terms of staying in school and the adolescents that have gone through those programs having good self-images, not getting pregnant or abusing drugs or other chemicals, that we've been paying attention to that and making that a priority, that kind of program a priority in some of our funding as well. So I think we're paying attention to the evaluation studies that have been going on in the legislation for children. With regard to child care itself, however, I think that what Minnesota has tried to do is to respect the individual choices of families, to say that there is not just one way that a child has a positive experience within a family, however we would choose to define the family, or in a daycare setting, and to not presume to make those kinds of choices for families, whether they be with a single provider, whether they be in a daycare center type of setting, whether it be with still with a relative, and that the state can be supportive of parents' choices for their children, rather than coming up with a model and saying this is the one that works in our mind, and no other is going to receive state support in any kind of way, whether it is institutional support or funding.
There's a couple of things that enter in when you're talking about the accountability of how the money's said that Ann has led into. I'd like to expand on. One of them is that with children, the accountability takes a long time. It took Head Start to really be able to prove to everyone what we assumed 20 years ago, because we had to have those 3-year-olds become 20 in order to say what will the 3-year-old be like when they're out of high school and into the real world. And it's hard for politicians to wait 20 years. We're going to be voted out of office, or someone's going to want to change the program. They want answers right away.
This is the 2-year syndrome?
The 2-year syndrome, yes. And
long-term plan is 2 years.
So what we end up doing is evaluating the adults that work with the children. That's happening right now in education. There's a great demand for education money to be accountable, but no one wants to wait 10 years for the 5th graders to be 15. So instead they evaluate the teacher and say, did 85% of the children get a B on this test? And if they didn't, then you're going to have to retest. And if they don't the second time, you're not going to be eligible for your merit pay. And we give these nice sounding names like Mastery of Learning, but what we're really doing is a very short-term evaluation. Of course, children don't learn that way. So that's one bind we can get into, and I'm really excited right now that my colleagues in the House and Senate seem to be willing to look more at waiting for some long-term results and not getting the instant answer back. The other thing that's happened is, in a simpler time, families could be the ones that were totally responsible for children. And they really weren't affected a lot by people outside the family. And now, of course, with transportation taking them away from their own neighborhood community, particularly in the rural areas, but even in the urban areas for school, with families moving a lot, we no longer have to say, as we used to say, programs are only for children whose families fail. So the state steps in, the government steps in when you're a bad parent. In fact, we called it that way in the juvenile court system. Now we're saying a lot of families need help, and you don't have to be determined to be a bad parent in order to have help. But what we're leaning toward now more is what Ann said, where we're giving the families the choice to make some of these decisions themselves. What does my child really need? What kind of school do they need? What kind of child care they need? In terms of child abuse and neglect, what we need to do is move more towards helping those families early on to learn how to be good parents with their children. And yet what we're stuck with right now, because mainly funding problems, is we only help the families that have been determined to be so terrible that they're probably going to have to remove the children. And you've thus gotten to the point you've destroyed that child's best hope instead of focusing early on with the family. So I think in nearly everything we do with families, whether it be health care or education or intervening when the family's out of control, or drugs, and drugs are having such an impact upon children now, and yet if we don't address the parents' chemical abuse problems, we're not going to be able to help the children. We've got to look at the child within the whole family, and that again takes more of a long-range approach. We're not going to be able to say in the 1991 session, well, we've saved 500 kids from drug abuse since 1989. You know, it's not going to be easy to evaluate.
Do you get a lot of opposition from people who say that the state is stepping into their lives and taking control over their children when they don't want to?
Not as much as at one point we did. I think there has been a recognition, and it's been a slow dawning of that recognition, that these are problems not just confined to the metropolitan area, they're statewide problems. That the whole child care issue, 12 years ago you did hear from legislators, that's not a problem in my district. The kids are staying home with their mothers, there's no need for us to do anything to support child care. That isn't the case anymore. So that argument used to be around. It's certainly nowhere near as prevalent now.
This is perhaps a loaded question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and I think I'll direct it to Representative Rest because of her educational background and her strong interest and experience in it. Despite an ever-increasing amount of money that's being spent on public education in Minnesota, and I recognize that most people in the field feel that even more money should be spent, but despite that increasing amount of money, why are so many of our high school graduates coming out virtually functionally illiterate or can't write? What's happening to our system with the legislature funding increasing amounts of money for education? And I notice in the polls or in the tests that Minnesota apparently is starting to slip from its #1 spot in the ranking of its high school graduates.
Well, I think there's a whole complex of questions
I
and
know, we could
issues
spend
with
a
that
whole
with that
several
one
issues on programs on this.
remark. I think that students themselves are aware of or confront an extremely difficult time growing up, that they are distracted by many other kinds of things than the learning that's going on in the classroom, that they often may feel that their lives have no real direction, and it's very hard for them to feel internally the value of knowing how to communicate well and to understand the communications that are coming their way, although that certainly is the mark of a cultured society, and it's a value, reading and writing and being able to express oneself, that we can't give up on, no matter how frustrated we may feel by the results sometimes. I think teachers work very hard to provide a learning setting that students will feel eager about and comfortable in. Unfortunately, it doesn't always turn out that way. Mm-hmm. We hope that by increased funding, we are going to be providing additional opportunities and ways in which good results can come about. When it doesn't happen, again, the legislature and school districts and taxpayers feel frustrated by that. but you don't turn your back on the public school system because of setbacks. It seems to me you look for ways of making the dollars that are there be channeled into programs or activities that have had some success, and you work hard to turn some of those numbers around, recognizing too that again Minnesota does not offer an educational system in a vacuum, and to pay attention to what's going on in other states as well, and learn from them, and to understand that what we are experiencing here is also part of a national trend.
I think too we always have to remember that because we have such a high graduation rate, we should not expect the kids who graduate from high school in Minnesota to meet the same measure as the kids who graduate from high school with a low graduation rate, because of course they're weeding out the ones who can't or won't or don't do as well.
Who haven't stayed.
Yeah, and we have one of the highest graduation rate in the nation. But on the other hand, we should not, as you said, just take it for granted that because you've got your degree, you have anything to offer. I think one, in addition to everything Ann said, one mistake we make in education right now, kids seem to have the sense that they're really going to have to fight to get a job. I mean, they learn. I used to teach preschool, and the parents of preschoolers would worry about, 10 years from now, will my child be competitive for the right college or whatever. And in fact, we're going to have a great need for an educated workforce by the year 2000. Those kids are going to be in big demand if they can understand that now and see, some reward. Right now, I think a lot of them don't see the reward. They see that they'll get through high school, have their degree, and then what? They see a big falling off a cliff. In fact, a lot of kids describe graduating from high school and college, or even VOTEC, as falling off a cliff. How do I get a job? And I think we have to pay more attention to that. I think the other problem, as I mentioned earlier, is that teachers are getting more and more pressure to, in fact, inflate the evaluations of the kids, because the teachers are pressured to look good themselves. And we also need to offer the kids lots of different ways of learning. And that's why, among other things, when my children were little, I took them to a library hour once a week. It was something different. It was something new. And our educational systems have a real good track record of working with the library systems. And people know now libraries aren't just books anymore. You can go and get a lot of different ways of learning. And who knows what will reach a particular teenager, And I just say expose them to as many different methods and adults as you can to find the one that clicks, the one that catches their enthusiasm and makes them believe in themselves. I think that's the hardest part.
But beyond that, I think we have to make sure that our schools are demanding more than mediocrity out of those students who are capable of producing more. And I think sometimes that is the case. If they can get by, they're allowed to get by.
Well, you raised an issue, but that's certainly dear to my heart as a librarian. We have this, this whole issue of when does education really begin? And in libraries, we feel very strongly it begins well before preschool times. And I wonder what kind of programs or what view the legislature has of that concept of preschool learning. And you're right, I know parents who have a 4-year-old who's worrying what college they're going to get into, which is rather frightening of the pressure they're going to go through. But that's when it does start. How do we reach these children? Is the legislature in a position to do anything about it, or is that a local school issue or a local county issue?
Well, we have done things with the schools for a number of years on the preschool education, the early childhood intervention, both in terms of health issues, in terms of school readiness issues. Again, usually the individual decisions for a particular school district are left up to that district, but there have been funds not just for pilot programs, but for ongoing programs for the school districts to set up such programs, and we are emphasizing, I think, more and more in our funding both the need for this type of program and the sort of payoff we can expect from it.
I think too that success in this area does come one child or one family at a time, and that we tend to look at group statistics and measure our success that way, or failure for that matter, and perhaps that's also a mistake that institutions make. There's a program in my school district through the Early Childhood Family Education Program that is an apartment site program. That is, that they have rented an apartment, and the mothers and the children come to that center rather than, or actually the center has come to them because that's where they live. And a few weeks ago, I was able to visit that site one morning and spent the time with the mothers who were learning phonics and studying for a GED, while their children were in the very next room with professional staff. They felt comfortable. They knew their children were being dealt with in an extremely competent manner, and they were doing academic work in order to provide a better life for their children. And it wasn't a classroom of 50 or 60 people. It was 4 women and the teacher, and me as an observer. And there was no doubt in my mind that those women were going to be successful in the goals that they had set for themselves. But it wasn't them having to go through a lot of red tape to reach a program. The program was coming to them. The same thing has happened with the experimental program with the library, with Hennepin County Library in the bookmobile to daycare providers. It's very difficult for a family daycare provider to take their children and get them all in car seats or whatever, and get them or lined up or however, and get them to a library. But bringing the library, which is a tremendous social service resource, to the children and in that setting seems to me to be something that not only counties in and of themselves and school districts should support, but also the legislature. And it's a different idea of what service means, and I think should be applauded.
And that's so critical, as Ann said, to bring the service there. I taught in both a federally funded preschool for families in a poverty area and in a middle class one. And when I was working in the one in the poverty area, we kept emphasizing to the parents in both, the best thing you can do for your child is sit down and read a story to them at night. Well, in the poverty area, until a bookmobile came to a parking lot in their neighborhood. And once we found that out, then it became easy, And with the middle class, it was no problem. There, the problem was to get them to stop trying to use the movable alphabet in the refrigerator and just relax and sit down and read them a story instead.
Well, in one area, I really have sympathy for members of the legislature, and I'm going to talk about tax dollars for just a second here. Given the amount of tax dollars you have, where would you place any kind of emphasis on a reallocation? Would you place the emphasis on prevention? We're talking about preschool, or do you place the prevention on, or the emphasis on remedial, which at one far end is jail, unfortunately, or terrible personal social problems like drugs? And how do you juggle those allocations? A little bit of both and not enough for either? Or, how does the legislature face this? I don't know, maybe since you've become known as one of the tax persons of the state, and I don't mean that you levy taxes, I mean that you have to deal with the tax allocations. How do you deal with this issue?
Well, it's always a difficult issue because we tend certainly to be reactive rather than proactive, and we concentrate on the end result, building more prisons, hiring more police officers. And I don't think we can shirk our responsibilities in that area. On the other hand, yes, we have to do both, and certainly to take a cost-effective approach for the long run demands that we look at prevention in many areas. Health problem prevention, health screening for young children, prevention in terms of preventing future educational problems, again with screening and remedial work and so forth. But we need to I think, shift the emphasis more than it actually has been at this point. And I do see a growing concern in the legislature for the front end of the problems, the areas which lead to the problems developing, which then are tremendously expensive to try to take care of. But there's no easy answers to that. And certainly, in part, the mix of where we put our emphasis depends on the stability of our revenues and the flow of the revenues in any one particular year.
I think one of the concerns some people have with revenues, and that's rightly or wrongly, there seems to be some perception out there that with a very wide range of organizations or institutions or just people who are providing children's services of one kind or another, there is collectively very little accountability with how this amount of money is being spent, which when you add it up in its totality is a large amount. But how do you get a handle on that? How does the legislature get a handle on that? You constantly have these groups coming up with another program, with another request for money. And I know we talked about that earlier in the program, but how do you deal with it? That's a tough one.
Well, we do tend, of course, to put the money on the programs that have proven themselves, Head Start being the most common example now. And I carried the bill to increase state Head Start money in the 1989 session. It was fairly easy because it was a proven program, plus the Head Start organization had taken pictures of children in every legislative district over the state. And it wasn't my burden to explain to my rural colleagues that you do have Head Start children. They knew that. But I think also we need to have our standard of accountability be the same for Greater Minnesota Corporation, be the same for MnDOT. I used to serve on semi-states and Department of Transportation. Obviously, roads are given that almost everyone agrees we need. But, are we looking at the money being spent on the roads the same as we're looking at the money being spent on libraries, which right now kind of has to fight a turf battle with a lot of other people. And so I think one direction that we're going that I'm happy with is that we're trying to give each area at least a minimum amount of credibility, not have to prove yourself over and over and over again, and make some assumptions. There's some things that are common knowledge, and someone always wants you to bring in a research paper to prove something we all know, and you can waste all your time looking at the research. On the other hand, if you never look back at the programs, and this could happen real easily in bureaucracies, and that kind of depends in part on the quality of the commissioner. That's why I'm so happy right now with our Commissioner of Education, Human Services. I think they're both just outstanding in demanding that these different programs that are funded through the state departments, that they be accountable, that they, not just look good on paper, but that you reevaluate them every year in terms of how they're working, if they're doing what they say they're doing.
I think we would have we're in a better position when we have more programs to fund than we have resources for than if we didn't have enough good programs for the limited resources that we have. It's a hard place to be, but it's a better place to be than not having enough good programs.
I think that's a good point. A little competition is good for all of the programs. And I speak from some personal experience. I remember years back when the highway department could do no wrong, and all they did was ask for money and they got it. The rest of us were in effect groveling for a little dollar here and there and had to prove the issue at every legislative session. Well, we've been very fortunate to have such three distinguished speakers for the legislature in front of us this evening. I hope our program has helped you get a better understanding of some of the issues on child care and child welfare and some of the problems that the legislature has to face in dealing with these issues. I hope it's broadened your horizon and your understanding of the needs for children's services in our state and in our area, and perhaps some better understanding of the funding problems that we're all facing. And thank you very much for watching, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's a real pleasure to have three such real strong people on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert Rohlf, and Representatives Dee Long, Ann Rest, and Kathleen Vellenga. And thank you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.